great. Share screen? Yes, please share your screen now, and Robert, get ready to broadcast as soon as the screen share is up.
Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon from a rather gray and snowy and sleety New York. It's a pleasure to see you all, in a sense, remotely, to connect with you as a community via our not so new now medium of Zoom. It's great to have you here for this important event. My name is Joy Connolly. I am honored to serve as president of the American Council of Learned Societies. And again, welcome you all here. I want to start by thanking all of you for coming, all of our panelists for devoting their time and their wisdom to this conversation. I want to thank Bill Kirby, whom I'll introduce in a moment, who is going to moderate and lead our discussion. I'd also like to thank the people who made this Zoom session possible behind the scenes, my colleagues Riska Putri, Robert Keogh, Nicole Glotzer, and especially Mary Richter, our Chief Development Officer, who wears many hats and who organized this panel for you today. So thank you to all of you and all my colleagues at ACLS who make our work possible. And again, thank you for coming. My role here is a very happy one. I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for today, Bill Kirby. In addition to serving as chair of the ACLS board, Bill has many hats in his scholarly life, in his administrative life, in his service life. He is also, I'm very proud to say, a past ACLS fellow, a winner of one of our ACLS fellowships. Bill serves as T.M. Chang Professor of China Studies at Harvard University. He's also the Spangler Family Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. He serves as director of the Fairbanks Center for China Studies, and he's chairman of the Harvard China Fund. And to me, honestly, there could be no better moderator for this discussion because Bill exemplifies in his, as I said, his many hats as a scholar, as a teacher, as an administrator, as a person who does outreach, who does an enormous amount of work connecting people around the globe, really exemplifies the many faces of humanistic scholarship, the many different ways in which the energy of a humanistic scholar and the wisdom of a humanistic scholar can work itself in the world and have positive effects in the world. So Bill, thank you for your service to ACLS, which is ongoing as chair. It's a delight to work with you, a real pleasure. And thank you so much for moderating this panel. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Joy. It's a great pleasure to be with you all. And I want to welcome all of those who have zoomed in from near and from far. You know, I will be, of our panelists today, an exception to a rule. That is to say, I had an undergraduate and graduate degree in history, and I had the fate of actually being able to practice what I have studied. Although I dare say that without the support of ACLS, when I was an assistant professor, I would be doing something honest for a living instead. So it's a great pleasure to see you all here, and it's a great pleasure to host you on behalf of ACLS under Joy's dynamic leadership. And I thought just to dive right in, you've seen the biographies of our distinguished panelists, but I'd like to ask each of them to say something about themselves and how they came to do what they're doing, and what, if anything, it had to do with what they studied once upon a time. So Dafra, may I start with you and your self-introduction?
Yeah, that sounds great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dafra Holder, and I'm currently a product manager at Meta. I've spent the last 15 years of my career across a breadth of industries. I started out actually as a sales trader on Wall Street. I transitioned into a more technical career as a PM, and I've worked on social platforms. I've worked on marketplaces. I've worked in online retail and physical retail. I've worked on hardware, the Internet of Things, smart home, fintech, and also the nonprofit world as well. And I say that because so much of this interdisciplinary approach that I've had to my career, I owe very much to the interdisciplinary approach that I took to my education. I graduated from Princeton with a degree in political science, as well as a certification in Germanic studies. Really excited to be here, but I do want to touch on this initial question that you asked, which is, what really motivated my decision to, take this humanities degree that I had and really transition into a career that doesn't really resemble the political science or Germanic studies degrees that I have. And I'd say there are probably three things that have been significant motivators for me. I think one thing that made it really easy was that a lot of my day-to-day, both in my job currently, but also previous roles that I've had, have centered a lot around writing and communicating, which are things that I had to do pretty significantly in my undergrad and just having a liberal arts degree overall. The second thing that I'd note is that so much of being in the humanities is having to think, and really more specifically, being able to critically think and articulate one's point of view, which is something that I have to do day to day to be successful in my role and in working with the partners that I support as well. And then the last thing that I would note is really making sure that I am very holistic in the approach to my work. And I think that is very much tied, or there's a very significant through line to this interdisciplinary approach that I mentioned before, which is being able to operate across multiple dimensions and perspectives, taking all of those things into consideration and being able to ultimately synthesize a very strong point of view as a product manager who's building products that impact and also support millions of people across the world today. I'll pause there.
Thank you very much, Deborah. Let me turn to Paul, let you have your say and introduce yourself to this wonderful crowd. You're muted, I think, Paul.
I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm Paul Sperry. I run an investment bank here in New York. We focus on working with small private companies. I founded the investment bank a little over 30 years ago with my wife, who's my partner in the business. She and I also own and operate a manufacturing company in Iowa called Percival Scientific. We manufacture biological incubators and plant growth chambers, primarily oriented toward researchers in the broad agricultural and entomology fields. I studied history as an undergraduate. I thought I wanted to teach and write history, so I went to graduate school. I got into a PhD program. Well into the program, I decided to take a year sabbatical just to take a break with every intention of going back. But 1 year led to 2, led to 3, and pretty soon it became obvious I was having, I found business to be sufficiently fun and challenging and rewarding. I never did go back to complete my graduate work. Perhaps the Academy's better for that. But you know what's relevant that I got out of my studies in the humanities and social sciences. I'm cognizant that our moderator is a professor at the Harvard Business School, so I want to be tactful about this. But I think I took 2 economics courses as an undergraduate, and one was labor economics, taught by an affirmed socialist who'd spent most of his career organizing for unions. I've never taken a business degree in my life or a business course in my life. I taught myself accounting and corporate finance, and the rest I just learned by doing. And I have to say, I attribute that to all the skills and experience, frankly, I got in studying social sciences. I mean, at the end of the day, look, I want to drive across a bridge by, a bridge that's designed by a degreed engineer, and I guess I want my knee surgery performed by a degree doctor. But for lots of career paths and jobs out there, the technical skills can really be learned. What's really difficult is figuring out how to ask the question, what questions to ask, and then how do you go about finding the answers or the solutions. That is really the key to most career paths, to success in most career paths. And that's what I think we in the humanities and social sciences really learn.
Thank you very, very much, Paul. Renee, please.
Yep. Hi, everyone. I am Renee Wittemeyer, and I work at Pivotal Ventures, which is the investment and incubation company that was founded by Melinda Gates. I can tell you guys more about that. My path to where I am today, so I did my undergraduate degree in sociology, anthropology, a double major with environmental studies. And after my undergrad, it was at a liberal arts college, Middlebury College in the Northeast. And after that, I got a fellowship to study abroad. So I spent about 2 years in East Africa, working in a national reserve, working with villages and particularly women who lived around the park on economic development issues. And following that, I did a public policy degree at Princeton and spent more time in the field realized that I really, really liked working with communities and understanding people's lived experiences. And that led me to, and also I loved asking questions and critical questions about structures and society and my place within that. And so I ended up at Berkeley and did a PhD in development studies focused on technologies and economic development, implications for gender and implications for e-governance. And this was several years ago. And back in that time, there was only a few actors also researching and studying that space of technologies and economic development. And two of those were Microsoft and Intel, which were not any on my radar as, you know, research organizations that I looked to. I ended up working with Microsoft Research Labs while I did my field work in India. And that really gave me an introduction to the private sector. I had worked for nonprofits before that, but also how to be a translator of research and social science material and information to computer scientists and engineers, and how important that translation is, to have a way to speak about values and culture and society and how technologies fit within that, so that these people who are working and building these products and technologies aren't living in isolation, but really understand how does that fit into the broader societal landscape. After that, I ended up working at Intel as a social scientist on a team of designers, computer scientists, engineers, and anthropologists. And we traveled around the world, understanding how technologies are used in people's lives. I then switched over to the policy side of Intel. So I started working in the corporate philanthropy side and led a lot of the efforts around gender and STEM, and how do you get more women and underrepresented groups into the tech industry. And after being at Intel for about a decade, I moved over to Pivotal Ventures to lead Melinda Gates's, as she just started this startup company. It's completely separate than the Gates Foundation. It's LLC, so we can deploy different types of capital, both philanthropic capital and investment capital. And basically went over there to lead Melinda's work on innovation, on women in tech, and how do you look at traditional topics and structures that aren't working for society and try to innovate and find solutions to drive social impact.
Thank you very much. So I'm just going to ask a few questions to our panelists. I'm going to start with you, Renee. You went to college at Middlebury, a place that in some ways, you know, any of you have been to this campus, it's one of the most beautiful campuses in the United States, in the frozen north. It is almost an example of, you can think of nearly ivory tower. All the buildings are this beautiful light gray sandstone and granite of Vermont. And you were an anthro major. And yet Middlebury had just built, if I'm not mistaken, given its new science center there, which happens to be, I think still to this day, the largest building in the state of Vermont. And so you didn't go into that. You were an anthro soc major, and found and we're not lured into, you know, the whole point of building that building was to lure you in a different direction and to keep Middlebury, you know, or get Middlebury into the forefront of liberal arts colleges, strong in the sciences. And then you end up at Intel, which you just described. Sounds like it has a larger anthropology department than Middlebury. What are the anthropologists? Tell us a little bit more about what the anthropologists do at Intel.
Yeah, so at Intel, when I was there, we had, so there's at some of the big companies, including Meta and Amazon and Microsoft, they have research labs. And so there's all sorts of researchers. And as Dafra was saying, interdisciplinarity is so key to those spaces. That wasn't always the case. I think so when I joined Intel, it was in 2008, I joined this team of, it was called the People and Practices Research Group in Intel Labs. And I think it was about 8 years old. So they had to make a case of why this was so important from a business perspective and also from a user perspective. And so as researchers, we would literally go, one of the things they were looking at the time when I was there was emerging markets. How do we break into emerging markets? How can people and it was a big interest in what quote unquote the bottom of the pyramid. So they were thinking about people with lower incomes, but with enough disposable income that they were willing to spend on technologies. How do you think about that segment of society as from an Intel perspective as consumers and users of technologies? And so we would spend time in the field interviewing people and talking not about a product and bringing a product and say, hey, what do you think about this? But really understanding their values, really understanding the cultural constraints that they face, the economic constraints they face, and then taking that information as context and being in the room when someone's saying, I want to sell this $200 laptop. Do you think that will be interesting to that segment of people? And being the person who can have a conversation with a technical group of people about why and how that may or may not be appropriate.
Very cool. So they do everything except publish in anthropology journals. So
my team was very active in publishing as well. So that was for people in industry research lab, it's a very tricky dance of wanting to have a foot in academia and be publishing, probably not at the rate of people who are in academia, but still having a toehold there.
Well, that is a story that I would not have imagined, although I've been, having little Intel chips in my machines for as long as I can remember. So let me turn to you, Dafra, and ask you, as you look at potential employees, what kind of skills, attributes are you after? How much do you consider somebody's undergraduate versus their graduate degree, merits of social sciences and humanities compared to others? We have so many CEOs and leaders of companies say that they would love to hire young humanists and so on, and yet the people in the HR office tend often not to get that message. So what are you looking for in talent?
Yeah, this is a really great question. And I want to just echo some of the things that Renee also talked about as well. I think the things that are most important for me when I look at a resume or I'm evaluating a candidate, particularly within the lens of product, because obviously that's where I've been spending a lot of my time in my career. How someone thinks is actually probably the most important thing. And how someone makes decisions is also the other important thing. So much of my day-to-day, and Renee alluded to this in what she was sharing about working with research, working with design, and other key stakeholders, is really being able to take a large amount of information and inputs that are coming to you from various different stakeholders with different motivations and ways of working, and really using that to ultimately come up with a conclusion. And I can be a little bit more specific about what that looks like for me in the world of product and why this is really important for me to have this very open lens with how I evaluate candidates. Most of my day is really centered around people problems. As a product manager, this is literally the ground zero of how we think about what technical products we build. We want to understand what the value, just to borrow another word from Renee, is. We don't want to build things that people won't use. And so starting with a people problem is really important. Understanding what value a product might bring to someone, understanding why this problem exists, being able to actually dissect that problem in conjunction with design and researchers, and then thinking about what solutions ought to be built. So I think for me, really a lot of my evaluation on candidates is, how do you think about problems? How do you work through really hard decisions and trade-offs? Most of the interviews that I do, they're really not, couched in technical skills at all. They're often about working through or talking through a problem together and understanding how someone makes a decision. So that to me is really, really important and something that I'm always looking for. I think the last thing that I would add is, really just having a genuine curiosity and appetite to learn and really ask questions, which I think is at the center of what it means to be a student of the humanities. Because oftentimes I don't actually necessarily know the answer. I'm going through collecting data, collecting inputs, whether they're qualitative or quantitative, and asking questions so that I can really, draw conclusions and ultimately have a very clear understanding of the space within which I'm operating. So those are things to me that are a lot more important. Certainly they sound a lot softer than hard skills, but are ultimately, I think, a lot more valuable, at least within within my line of work.
Thank you. Paul, man, you're trained as a historian of early America, and there's still time, of course, to submit the PhD. The statute of limitations is very long in American history, but one of the things that we always say, and years ago when I was dean here at Harvard, we redid the undergraduate curriculum particularly in all areas, but with a great focus on the arts and sciences, broadly speaking, with the idea that our purpose in so doing was, of course, to educate individuals, but also to educate citizens. That is, people who would have the knowledge to make decisions about their lives, about their leaders, about their values, individuals who'd be independent of mind, not simply carrying on something transmitted from one generation to the next. And this is the purpose, whether it's at Middlebury or at Princeton or at Reed or so many of the great liberal arts colleges and universities in the United States. This is a central point of it, a really distinguishing feature of American higher education. You don't find it really anywhere else to the same degree. How do you see this, looking now in your historian's view, but also from your professional perspective and experience, how do you see how humanistic education might contribute or should contribute, can contribute to strengthening what is a pretty bare civic fabric, it seems, at times in recent years, strengthen democratic citizenship and indeed global citizenship?
Well, thank you. That's
it's like a PhD exam question. So.
No, that's an interesting question, and an important question. Look, schooling, undergraduate or graduate, really is about setting the base for our lives. And we have many lives. We have a career, we have sort of extracurricular, and then we have, as you've mentioned, sort of a civic life. And it seems to me that what we choose to study, or choices both as an undergraduate and if we go to graduate school, are only helping to sort of inform and set the base for all of the lives, or all the aspects, the various aspects of the life that we're then going to go on to live. Look, Bill, I think you and I, and by the way, I this is not the question you asked, but I feel obliged to say this. My career is in business, but I still consider myself a scholar. I don't teach, and I have yet to publish. I'm working on some articles, but I have yet to publish. But I nonetheless consider myself part of the scholarly world. And I think for many out there in the audience who wonder, if they leave academia, does that diminish in any way, you know, their life as a scholar? I'd sort of say no. But specifically to your point, you know, I think humanists can view the world in a context and with a perspective that that is really enriching, and then without it, you really are missing much. I mean, I'll give you a specific example. To your point, you know, many feel that we have a dysfunctional Congress today, and in many ways it is. But in a historical perspective, Joanne Freeman at Yale wrote a great book about the dysfunction and violence in antebellum Congress. I mean, what we're seeing in Washington today is nothing like we saw in the 1840s and 50s, right? A historian can put this in context and has a perspective on this. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think perhaps part of the problem we have in the civic discourse these days is that we don't have enough emphasis on the humanities and social sciences.
As you were speaking, I was reminded of right outside the Harvard Yard is a statue of Senator Sumner, who was caned into a coma on the floor of the United States Senate in the antebellum period. So you're quite right. Well, thinking keep your scholarly hat on for a moment. You know, Renee, you have a doctorate. Paul, you're going to be submitting one, and a lot of the folks who are watching us this afternoon have doctorates or are considering PhD programs. What kind of advice would you give them as they consider their career trajectory after a doctorate? Because, you know, I can speak, you know, sadly, in most history departments or in most graduate schools of arts and sciences, the people they work with are in the faculty, and they really only know one industry. And they know one trajectory of, they can help you a lot in getting the next job in English literature or so on, if those jobs exist. But they're very bad, really bad at helping individuals, you know, think of what to do in the world of business. And if you go to the career services are almost exclusively for undergraduates, and they're all heading into consulting and banking. Maybe that's what PhDs should do. I don't know. But what advice would you give for career trajectories, both of you? Renee, maybe you can start, and then Paul.
Sure. So for some people who are thinking about PhDs, academia is the route that they want to pursue. And that path is really obvious, and they want to do the whole tenure track professor path. My husband is a professor, and so we were like these two potential academics together, and I was watching he was a little bit ahead of me, and I had already decided that going down that path was not the right one for me. And so then it's a less obvious path. And I think for me, it was really looking at the actors in my area of study. So it was pretty obvious for me. I was doing my research around technologies and development, and suddenly these other groups started appearing very interested in my research topic, which were corporates, which I'd never imagined myself landing in. But it's part of it is looking at the other actors in your space, in your discipline, who may be interested in either your research product or that topic. But I would also say that, again, like at Intel, we had sociologists who had studied time, like that, you know, like that was their topic for their dissertation. It had nothing to do with technologies. And so I think there's just like understanding the ecosystem of, if research is a path that you want to pursue with that PhD, understanding the types of research labs and institutions. There's consulting firms that are looking for researchers. There's actually so many different non-obvious places to look. And I think part of it is just starting that investigation beyond what you would hear, as you're saying, from your university, because oftentimes those are opportunities that are just not known.
Good. Paul, some thoughts on the same point?
Well, look, you're absolutely right. I think, especially given what's going on in higher education relative to tenure track positions, we're producing far too many PhDs for realistic tenure track outcomes. I don't necessarily see that as a crisis. I'm actually quite involved with graduate arts and sciences up at Columbia. I was for a decade on the board of the Organization of American Historians. To me, I think it's just critical that the programs communicate realistic job prospects in academia, but not necessarily dissuade people from pursuing the PhD. I mean, there's always the financial aspect of it. And I know this may sound like a dilettante answer, but I really don't think it is. I mean, I think we should all study what interests us, because I can say, and I will say, I'm an example, and I am not an anomaly. I have had a fine, pleasing, rewarding career outside academia, and yet my schooling path, one would never assume where I ended up from my schooling path. I think, again, I think that I got out of my educational experience the critical tools and skills I needed to probably succeed in hundreds of career paths. I just happened to choose the one that I went down. So I would never dissuade anyone from getting an advanced degree or from studying humanities or social sciences as an undergraduate. And I really do believe that there are a host of career avenues for those graduates. To me, what's most important is that you're bright, you're motivated, you're interested, and you have diligence and perseverance, right? If you have that, you can get in just about any field. Employers are going to want you, right, Dafra? I mean, if someone fit those qualifications, and again, you want them to have the liberal arts skills you articulated, but if someone is motivated and they have determination and they really want to be in your group, that's who you want.
I would pile on that. I think another thread that Dafra had said around interdisciplinarity, that people with social science and humanities backgrounds also just like the lens and view on the world of critical thinking, being reflexive, understanding how power and society work, are all huge contributors to a team of people who most people probably don't have that lens. And that person becomes this incredible translator and adds a differentiated and huge value add to the conversation, the writing skills, the ability to analyze and be critical about what you're reading and produce maybe not reinforcing some particular viewpoint that everyone has, but coming up with a different one. All of those things are so important. And it doesn't matter if you haven't worked in industry before. I think that's the other thing, or if you go not towards industry, you go into a nonprofit, even that, just having that skill set makes you differentiated.
I'm nodding vigorously because I totally agree with all of that. And it's also just reminding me of the 5 years that I spent at Amazon, where there was an incentive literally within the structure of career development for people to be fungible. And it was actually the first time I had heard this phrase. I'd never encountered this phrase in my career. And what they encouraged, and like I said, incentivized, was that people not be specialists at Amazon, that you could go from, maybe focusing on marketing one day to suddenly focusing on operations and then maybe product. And I really appreciated that lens of how they thought about what made someone successful, because I think, again, it goes back to this idea of being really interdisciplinary about how you approach things, that the things that really matter are that you're willing to be curious, which is actually one of their leadership principles. And, going back to what Paul was saying about sort of that hustle and that motivation, being willing to be an owner and have a bias for action, which are two other Amazon leadership principles. And I'm not saying that to cheerlead Amazon, but I'm just saying how a lot of these things that we're talking about, and these both soft and hard skills, get translated into how people can work at these companies that have a more, have a background that is more bent towards the humanities. That type of way of operating as well as thinking is definitely rewarded.
And I also, can I add one more thing? I think that it's almost on both ends of the spectrum, because you have people, I've had people come up to me and be like, I have a PhD in Armenian studies. I'm so specialized. What do I do now? And then you have someone who's a generalist. And I think it's like, if you have the PhD and you're so specialized, taking up, and you want to make a change, taking that story of how did you approach that problem and up-leveling it with the idea that you can basically approach any problem with the skills that you have. And then on the other side, the generalists with the fungible roles, I think that's like incredible. You had that social science, humanities undergrad, and now you can apply it in any way to any problem.
Bill, can I add just one more thing? I know we have more questions. I was listening to a podcast. It's called Conversations with Coleman. And I just want to encourage everyone to listen to season 3, episode 2. I just listened to it this weekend. He had a guest on, Rob Reich, who is a professor of philosophy at Stanford. And he actually was talking about this problem, which is that many universities are really trying to think thoughtfully about how we sort of bridge this gap between a humanities degree and, just the wealth of careers that one can have, and being a little bit more dynamic about where one can go after one matriculates. And one of the things that he mentioned was that at Stanford, they're taking this very interesting approach where they're really trying to go beyond theory and think more about this like practicum. How do you take all of these theories that you might learn, in his case, philosophy, and put it into practice? And because of where Stanford is located, the world of Silicon Valley. And what he has been designing over the course of the last year are courses where he is teaching alongside professors in computer science, professors in ethics, to teach a course about how to have and create more designs within product and within tech that are a lot more sensitive to things like ethics. So designing more ethically, talking about things like AI and what impacts that might have to just, the way we view the world today. And I just thought that was so brilliant. It was definitely not something that I encountered, at least in my undergraduate degree, but I did think that that idea of finding ways to really create those through lines and really bridge all of these different departments and courses is a really fascinating way of thinking about, how do you really connect the dots and really push this like interdisciplinary approach to learning and thinking that really does actually have everyday application. He also wrote a book, and I'm also not cheerleading for him. I just love this episode and I really want everyone to listen to it. But one of his books is called System Error: Where Big Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot. And he's really talking a lot about, again, this very interdisciplinary approach to thinking about tech and thinking about the way things get built that go beyond just philosophy, go beyond just computer science and ethics. So I really did think that was a really fascinating approach to this problem that we're talking about today.
Let me ask a kind of a practical question. It's actually a little bit of my own experience, and to the degree my memory is accurate. But when I was a graduate student, I determined to go on in the study of history as long as I found it interesting, discovered that I enjoyed teaching and I wouldn't have to go deeply into debt. And I started studying China at a time. And I think about 50% of what I thought was true about China when I started turns out not to be true. But that's okay. That's how fields progress and develop. But it was at a time of an abysmal job market. And I had a Fulbright to Taiwan. And I was invited by the director of career services to come and talk before I went to Taiwan. And I thought, oh, gee, this is amazing. They're so proactive. They're going to come and offer me, you know, knowing the job market being what it is, they're going to think of something else I could do after I finish my PhD. Instead, this was at a time of real tense US-Taiwan relations because we were pulling out our troops from Taiwan. He invited me to do some extra work for an unnamed American agency to basically to be a spy in Taiwan. And, you know, I thought to myself, well, last I saw Taiwan as an island. I'm not a very good swimmer, probably not a great idea. And I turned it down, but it was the only kind of option that was given, as it were, to would-be doctorates at that time. These, you know, we all, when you go through a doctorate program, or, you know, it's a very lonely process often. Individual work, a single or a few mentors, and so often in very small departments and very small coteries. How do you, and then you want to do something else, how do you start? I would have been very intimidated in those days if I really felt, gee, I'm going to go and do something in business, which I would have had to do if I hadn't been fortunate enough to get a position. So how do you start if you're, you know, and I don't mean with any one of you, but what might be a first or another step toward what's a very big and unknown thing? I think to many people, the idea of, you know, of Facebook, Intel being open to sociologists and anthropologists is a surprise. Any clues or help to our?
One thing I would say, it depends on where you are in your life, but I am a huge advocate of internships. If you can get a paid internship, that's the best. And paid internships can often lead to full-time jobs. An internship can also lead to a full-time job. It's basically the way you just are getting your foot right into the door. And that process, there's often processes for companies, but I would say the most critical one, and what I've used in my past, and actually how I even found the people at Intel, was just leveraging whoever you know and your network. And you're like, I'm interested in that. How do I get to figure out who I know who has any connection to X topic, X organization? And if you're willing and motivated, as Paul was saying, and like persistent, I've always surprised at how a persistent person keeps getting, that name of that person keeps getting circulated in amongst my team or people that I know, because they're so energetic and persistent and passionate about a topic. But it's get your foot in the door, use your network, use internships as a mechanism to do that.
And I would say, Renee and Bill, tell me if you think your life in academia is any different. If you ask me, the most valuable asset my wife and I have built in our career together, it's precisely that, the network. And the network's like a plant. You don't just put, it's constant, it needs constant feeding and watering, constantly working on it. But, you know, I think in probably every career, and I know it's harder for introverts. I know you probably can't tell. I sort of like just closing my door and being alone in my office, but thankfully my wife's an extrovert and she's the one who's, but the network is really key. I mean, it's key in academia. You want to always go out and find mentors and find those who can sort of give you advice. And you're going to need someone for your dissertation, and you're going to need someone to sort of help you think through articles. It is no different in the for-profit or not-for-profit world. And I will also say, building a network isn't a mercenary thing. It's not just about career. Some of my many of my great friends today came through business networks, right? I mean, it's a way to really sort of expand your life in addition to helping your career and creating opportunities.
Good. You know, thinking back then on some of the challenges, and we have and I'm going to pivot now to at least, and I have a couple more questions on my own, but there's one that fits in very well here from the audience, from Ryan O'Hallahan, who teaches an upper level course called Professionalization for the History Major. And he spends a lot of time getting students to understand how to articulate their skill sets in industry specific terms. From your perspective, and any panelists, please come in. What are the skills that you think humanities majors most struggle with in translating their skills into, whether it's cover letters, resumes, or so on? Is there something that leaps out to you, and advice that you've given to individuals that can be passed on? It's a great question, Ryan. Thank you. They can't all be perfect.
I think for me, it kind of goes back to a couple of the things that I mentioned before, which really fall into this realm of, how to think and how you assess problems, how you think through problems, et cetera. I think one thing that has probably been consistent for me across probably all of the different industries that I've worked with, and where I potentially see a challenge, is thinking about what impact looks like and how do you communicate the impact of what you've done. And I think for me, when oftentimes I'm looking at resumes or LinkedIn, this is probably the biggest gap that I see with students of the humanities, is just how they communicate the impact of what they've done. It's not just about, I wrote this thesis or dissertation, but just really, how do you translate the impact of what you did there? That to me is really, really powerful. So that's just one that came to mind immediately.
And I would just pile on that oftentimes people go too deep on the particular topic that they studied, and the value of being able to up-level and talk about the underlying skills and approach to critical thinking and writing and analysis, that often gets bogged down by but I did this in the in 1852, this thing happened, just getting too deep into your research and not up-leveling.
Oh, one other question generally, and then I'd like to invite members of the audience to submit questions. We have a number of good ones already, but we would absolutely welcome more. And we also have some interesting information in the chat from Joy and Mary. But let me just say, if you look at humanities and social science disciplines, particularly take economics aside, these enrollments are comparatively falling or stagnant in many places. Not everywhere, but in many, many places. Students have somewhat greater worry about employability and debt, even though the employment statistics for humanities majors and social science majors is only slightly below that of those in the STEM fields. But understanding the worries that students have about this, maybe especially for those who are first generation college students or students of color, what would you recommend to attract students to the humanities and social sciences at the undergraduate or graduate level? They're pushed toward, economics and applied math as a combination, or the push toward the computer science degrees. These are very strong and very understandable. So how do you? Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think one reflection that I have is just the alumni that I was exposed to during undergrad, specifically within my department. And when I think back to those experiences, it was often individuals or professionals who were working within the field of political science. I did not really have a lot of exposure to alumni who were doing things outside of that, or who had really done more creative things with their career, or maybe more entrepreneurial things with their career. And so I do think, again, this was many years ago, but I do wonder about that experience and how how much more we can maybe invest in making sure that students also see models of folks that are doing things more creatively with their degrees. Again, it just was not something that I was exposed to, but I think would have been incredibly valuable to me as an undergraduate.
Yeah, and I understand the worry of, is this a privilege? Is this luxurious to be able to study in the humanities and social sciences? And it's, parents saying, well, that's not practical. And I think, again, back to Daphra's point, I think just seeing examples of pathways into careers is really important, and role models of how other people have done it. Because I don't, as an employer, when I look at someone's, especially if someone's having right out of their undergrad and they want a job, I don't really care what discipline they came from. Like, I'm not, because especially in my line of work where I'm looking at broad generalists, and that's the type of people that I'm hiring, it's much more about the skills that they have, maybe the experiences that they have on their resume, and the idea of going into those fields, especially if you're passionate and excited about it, is my advice would be just do it and find experiences, whether it's a study abroad or whether it's an internship or whether it's a summer program, where you can have resume building things so that you have a story to tell as you're graduating about skills versus a particular discipline that's very narrow.
I think a lot about just this dominant advice that I got when I was an undergrad, which was that I had to either go onto Wall Street and kind of have a career in finance or consulting, law, or science. And when I tell the story of my career now, whether it's in an interview or in talking to someone or in an audience like this, I almost laugh a little bit about the fact that I started out in finance, because it feels like it was sort of mistaken advice, because I left my program within the first 2 years because I realized I did not have a passion for my purpose. And Renee, you brought up that word passion, and it made me think a lot about that. And I think that I would have been so much better served focusing on what my passion was to really start my career. I don't know if this line of thinking is, the way it is now on campuses, but I think I would have been a lot more, I would have been better served by maybe not having that thought for the 4 years. And I would ideally not, at least in my case, I wouldn't have wasted that time, because I wasn't excited about that work.
On the other hand, Daphra, I would say no experience is a wasted experience. Figuring out what you don't want to do in life is just as important as figuring out what you want to do, right? My answer, and Daphra, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think all of us who consider ourselves humanists and social scientists, we need to do a better job of articulating what we feel we got out of it and how it's really enriched and helped our lives. And that's at the college level, but that's actually us as friends, mentors, parents, and the rest. And, all of us who had a grounding in humanities and social science, we want to deal with evidence. We want to deal with data. And Bill, I'm sure you're aware of this. I mean, for those parents, and I understand it, and for those students who are worried about the huge financial commitment, huge. I mean, Bill, when you and I were in college, or when I was in college, you could actually work summers and through the year, and with a little bit of debt, get through an undergraduate. I mean, that's just not even remotely possible today, right? Even at our great public institutions, that's becoming less and less possible, right? So I understand the concern about trying to direct students to what is considered to be the more professionally prudent path. But there's been a number of studies that Inside Higher Education has published that has shown that while liberal arts majors at graduation earn less than those with professional degrees, in their peak earning years, liberal arts majors actually out-earn, and in some ways pretty substantially, those with professional undergraduate degrees. So there's actually evidence out there, and we need to broadcast this a bit better. I mean, everything isn't about economics, I understand, but for those who are worried about, I can't afford to do this and have my son get an English degree, well, you know, the evidence in some ways shows that to be not the case.
So again, getting back to the kind of the question of entry, I think the networks idea is, of course, a critical one. Some people, of course, have pre-existing networks that are powerful from parents and others more difficult to create them. But I'm reminded of, you know, the leaders. You just take one company, kind of a small unknown company, Goldman Sachs. So Goldman Sachs, among its recent, you know, leaders, Hank Paulson, Lloyd Blankfein, John Thornton, among them, every one of them either a history or an English major at a liberal arts college. And that was just the norm of once upon a time. And the worry that I hear so often from my own students is, gee, you know, I wouldn't get hired there. Again, getting back to the HR business. So is there a capacity? And of course, you know, it may well be that HR is a totally different world in Intel and Facebook than elsewhere. But do you all see this as a potential blockage? And is there something that those in industry could do to kind of at least give alternative pathways at the lower levels rather than others through what has appeared to be kind of a narrower gate? If you go directly through a human resources specialist. I'm paraphrasing here an excellent question by Adam Bliston. Nobody wants to take on HR. I don't blame you. Avoid it is the answer.
I remember the days when I would put my resume together and send it off and be like, I will never hear a response because I sent it to a black box. And that's typically not the way you get a job. I think back to your network, like sending it through HR randomly on the internet because something got posted is one way, and maybe you will get a job that way. I've never gotten any opportunity that way. It's always been through some connection, et cetera. And I think I recognize like the privilege of my connections because of the universities and institutions that I went to, but I didn't come from generations of family connections. So it was like basically every experience I had, I would try to make connections and not in an artificial way, it's also part of it's just relationship building, but using and thinking strategically about how can that mentor, how can that professor, how can that speaker who just came and spoke at your university potentially connect you to something else that's related to something you're interested in.
Good. So here's a question I hadn't really thought of, but it kind of pivots off the last one. David Walks has written it in, noting that career services folks or people who offer career preparedness advice to undergraduates sometimes these days have a hard time keeping up with changing job titles, thinking of what students might or might not be qualified for. That is, new job titles are appearing that nobody has seen before. Now in my profession, that's not true, but I'm sure it's true in the worlds in which you three work. You know, the question is, and I don't know, how can we help connect students with or help them identify job opportunities that technically do not yet exist? No crystal balls. Not an easy question. I think it's a matter, I assume from following up from what we've said before, is a matter of thinking of how you get to know people in a company or to get to know people in an industry and to learn what those opportunities are.
Yeah, I guess the other thing I would add there is that I feel like it almost contradicts like the earlier question, but I'm hoping that career services is keeping on top of these. I actually know why David is asking this question because I've seen it in my career where, there are emerging trends, every year. And suddenly as a result of that, roles are being built around those. And I guess my hope is that, the career services departments are keeping an eye on those things and, that they're also leveraging where possible, alumni that are doing those roles to help with, just decoding what that means and what skills are required.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think that there's trends that you see even in your own discipline as your ethics and AI, Dafra mentioned earlier. That is something that has been growing over the past 8 years. And from a small, there's ethical issues around artificial intelligence to now there's so many jobs being posted about that topic and we need to hire them. Every tech company is talking about this. And so as you're seeing in your own work, some of those trends emerging in the research, or even in the places that you're reading news, some of those places can give you a sense or spark an interest for you of an area you might want to pursue.
One of the things we haven't discussed so much, although in some sense it's implicit in our discussion of anthropology, or this kind of language training and international exposure. Christine Munoz writes an interesting question here. She teaches Spanish to students who approach language learning in what seems to be a distressingly instrumental way. I've never known students to be instrumental. I'm shocked to hear this, Christine. To the extent that this improves my job prospects, I'll work at it. And the struggle she finds is to persuade them that the more complete their immersion in the cultures, histories, and literatures, in this case embodied in the Spanish language, prepare them possibly for any and all jobs, which is what she's hearing from us, the panelists. And they will never be able to predict from their undergraduate years what those may be. Any ideas on how to inspire them to look beyond the next semester?
Now you're asking us to get into a 19-year-old's mind, right?
It's a challenge that some of us have every day, but yes. But it's really about the value of a deep international immersion.
Yeah, I guess I can, again, speak from the experience that I have. From where I sit, I'm not just building products for people in the US. And, I imagine for all of us in our careers, everything that we do has pretty significant global impact. And so one of the things I will say is that, on a day-to-day basis, as I'm building things, some questions that come up often are just, how will this product be localized? How will we translate this word? For example, I'm working on a product right now and we're trying to figure out naming. And it's been very hard because we landed on a name in English, but it doesn't work in all markets. And so we've been having to think through what that might look like. And then the last thing that I would say, and this kind of harkens back to something that Renee had mentioned earlier about research, is that I spend a lot of time doing research or working with research in different markets and literally going to places across the country and doing immersion work in them. One example was spending 2 weeks in Indonesia just to understand the dynamics of financial marketplaces in that market. And so, having a very global mindset about just who your user is, again, talking about my career and where I sit, is just so important and incredibly valuable, because, the version of user and, consumer or customer that I'm thinking about is, one that's global, not localized. So I think there's immense value in, having an undergrad or graduate degree that is focused around linguistics and understanding people and communities and the differences across people and communities.
Yeah, I'll pile on to that. I, as an undergrad, did a study abroad program, and it literally changed the course of my life. It was one semester in East Africa and Tanzania, completely out of my element of what I had been used to with a number of other students. And I learned Swahili, and it was incredibly important in just giving me, especially because it led me to study the economic development and all of that stuff, but also just an understanding of people's lived experiences that are so incredibly different than my own. And having that lens in everything that I do, now as I work at Melinda Gates's company, we are trying to solve systemic challenges in the US. It is much more, at Intel a very global role. I have a very US focused role now, but the same principles that I learned about understanding people's lived experiences, how does that lead to strategy development? How do you get evidence-based approaches to problem solving? All of that roots in that experience of being an undergrad. That's where it really started, and being in a place where you're immersed in a culture and understanding differences, as Dafra just said too.
In my own experience, I never would be doing what I'm doing now. And it wasn't in the China area if I had not, as an undergraduate, as sophomore, spent a term in Germany. And it wasn't as if we studied very hard. We met, our major course was met weekly in a Weinstube, excellent wine in the Rhineland. We traveled around a great deal. It was at a time of great political turmoil in the United States, so half of our courses were canceled in any event. But I had the understanding of capacity that I could actually survive almost anywhere. And I could make, I knew German actually pretty well, and it got a lot better at that point in time. And in my more recent work, teaching about doing business in China, it actually, not everybody needs to know Chinese in order to do business in China, but some people involved in some venture really need to know Chinese. And as it turns out, the best place to learn Chinese is China. It's a big shock, but it's, and sending students there to immerse them in that experience and to understand what can work. And this is not, it could be a matter of marketing, but how do you understand not just the culture, the language, how do you understand the political economy of the place in which you're going to work? If you're going to work in China and you don't know something about the Chinese Communist Party, well, you're going to be surprised. But there are analogies for virtually every place on Earth in this globalized world, in which, at least for the moment, still globalized world.
One other thing I would say is I do think that immersion gives you an outlook on life of like, yeah, this might be a completely different or weird experience, and this is field work. Like, and my colleagues often laugh at me because they'll look at me, I'll be like, it's field work, because we're just like walking into a situation where you just are open. It's going to be different, and you're going to learn something and just listen. And it might be uncomfortable, but it's that openness to being in that situation that you get from being immersed in those countries and cultures.
Different approach here from the more on the arts and then humanities. Felicia Azugu writes, music studies over here face a lot of problems, especially with practical elements. Now it's a practical question, students assisted with musical instruments, but actually does musical capacity, someone who comes to you as a musician, or a background as a musician, or has musical talents, is this something that on occasion you have found, my gosh, that there's something to this individual that you really want to bring onto your team, not simply to play the trombone, presumably?
I guess I just wanted to offer a perspective. I think Renee earlier talked about how much a lot of her job is translating I think, Paul, you even referenced this as well. And when I think about music, to me, that's fundamentally what it is, right? It's translation, it's interpretation, and also being fungible and creative. And so I don't know if I'm oversimplifying by saying that, but I just wanted to offer that as just a perspective on how to maybe frame one's career with that background. And then maybe on a more practical and fun note, I'm actually working on a product right now where we need sound design throughout it. And so the sound design is meant to create sounds and tones for various things that users are doing. And I'm working with some sound designers, many of which have musical backgrounds.
Okay. Let me turn to one more question from our comrades out there. This is Ryan again, writing actually back to Christine. Says he asks each student how much money it takes every day of class, on the first day of class, how much money it costs to take my class. And no one knows the answer. And how he's trying to get students to think of the value of their education, sounds like, Ryan, on an almost daily basis. Is any of that part of your experience? It's not part of mine.
Not knowing Ryan, not knowing Ryan, my answer to him would be priceless. So I'm not sure the discipline, but again, I think that's an interesting question. So students can start thinking about their studies in sort of a broader context, right? There's a lot of context as to why you're in school, and I guess a career and having the finances make sense is important. But again, I know I've already said this, but especially students in undergraduate and graduate, they have their lives in front of them, and there's going to be many aspects to their lives that are going to be informed and enriched by what they've learned in school, and it's not all just about money. Again, I've made the argument that for many liberal arts majors, there is indeed a financial return, but I'd hate to boil undergraduate and graduate experience down to just financial return.
Okay, is a different approach, and I wonder. You see, there's a lot of critique. So one of the interesting things is all of us are promoting here the idea of an education in the liberal arts and sciences at either the undergraduate or graduate level, or both. And at the same time that universities are coming under, and colleges under, a kind of a withering political critique that they are one side or of the political ledger and not at the other. There's a kind of a group think among undergraduates that it's very difficult for people to be different and express opinions that are not on the, just say frankly, the leftist mainstream in colleges and universities today. And Robert Malone puts it more directly. He says there's a perception that US professors are indoctrinating students with a liberal slant. I'm going to have to work on that. But I'm happiest when students disagree with me and challenge my assumptions and show me that they can think. So do you get at a sense of a current generation of undergraduates with whom you meet that there is a kind of a lack of intellectual diversity? It is a widely perceived, or it is a widely articulated criticism.
Which lack of diversity amongst the faculty or the students?
Students. Forget the faculty, students.
I don't find that at all. I don't find that at all. And I'm sure Renee and Dafra would agree. What I'm looking for when we hire, we want people with different backgrounds, different perspectives, different experiences. I'm old and experienced, but I'm more often wrong than I'm right. And I need people to show me where I'm wrong. I need them to have the strength in their conviction. Now, I want them to have done the work and to have provided the support to their position, right? But I need them to show me where I'm wrong. And I have to say, I actually, I'm not spending my life in the classroom. I'm not in the dorms. I can't opine on whether, what's going on the college campus, but I don't experience that students who are graduating in any way feel cowed in terms of willingness or ability to express their opinion.
Yeah, I was just rereading this question, and I guess maybe two things I would add. One was that in undergrad, I did mock trial and I did debate. And in addition to my degree, I often think about those experiences because they do show up in my everyday life, and they've shown up in my career in a lot of different ways, because so much of what I'm being asked to do, whether, as a product manager today or just other roles that I've held, is to really be able to have these difficult conversations that Paul was alluding to, having courage in my conviction, being able to disagree and commit, being able to have thoughtful discussions, thoughtful and intentional discussions around topics, a curiosity and a willingness to ask questions to make sure that we're evaluating whether it's a problem or a solution or a risk the right way. So I do actually think there's a lot of value in encouraging disagreement thoughtfully.
I was just thinking as I was thinking about that question, and this might be a good question on which to close. And I was thinking about it over the last several years. I've just finished a book on the evolution of the modern university from Germany to America, and as I put it, to China. Leaders of the 19th, 20th, and maybe or maybe not 21st century. But in the process of doing that on the American side, I read more and more. I have a huge shelf here of books about everything that's wrong with American higher education. Almost nobody writes a book about what's right with American colleges or universities. I worry about the lack of public trust in our institutions. 44 out of 50 American states are disinvesting in public higher education, which will have a bad impact also on private higher education. But you feel, and I sense this, you feel contrary to that. That is to say, the people that you are finding, not just yourselves in your own careers, but the people that you are finding who are graduates of colleges and universities, well, I will just ask you direct forward. Are you worried about the output in human terms of our colleges and universities today, or are you finding a wealth of talent with whom you look forward to working?
Bill, if I was looking to join my organization, I wouldn't hire myself today. The children, or the students that we're seeing, it's interesting. Rightfully, I think most opinion writers in the Washington Post and New York Times are questioning the future of the neoliberal globalized world. I'm optimistic because of the young students that I'm meeting. I think they're incredibly thoughtful, socialized, well-educated, and we're not just hiring from Hopkins and Middlebury and we're hiring from a range of institutions. And I actually think, listen, I despair with you the disinvestment, especially in the public institutions. It's just absolutely wrong. But I think one of the things we've really got going well here in the States is our system of higher education.
Efra or Renee, any thoughts on this? Worries, concerns, or sense of optimism?
Yeah, I think for me, it's actually very similar to Paul. I have a strong sense of optimism. I think that this generation of students have just been exposed to so much from a political, economic perspective, technologically, all of the advancements that we've seen in the last decade. I'm very, very encouraged. Also, I think the general just worldview and you know, looking at even just the last 2 years of, you know, social unrest in this country and seeing where those students have been positioned in it, I do think that, yeah, I think I'm encouraged overall.
I would add, I agree. I think that the talent is, you know, high caliber and diverse. I think that there's work to keep doing and work that we're doing on making and building bridges for opportunities, because oftentimes jobs and getting your foot in the door and all of those networks are these closed, reinforcing privileged networks. And how do people from different backgrounds and coming from community colleges who are doing a bridge to finishing their degree at a four-year institution, how do they get opportunities and into those networks and the asymmetries of power? Those are the things that I worry about and where we're trying to crack open so that there are more opportunities. And I think that it, for me, oftentimes goes back to those, how do we create those opportunities for more people to get opportunities, experiences, whether that's internships, and also on the employer side, how do we get some of the programs that we support are really showing tech companies, hey, there's diverse talent. You never hired from these schools before. Try it, because based on this program they just participated in with us, they're incredible. And we have, what's been really interesting, we have a program that we support, which is called Sprinternships, which is a tiny 6-week internship. Just that exposure that tech companies get to a much more diverse pool of candidates. Oftentimes people are hiring out of that pool. So it's trying to think about what are the new and other ways to expose employers to the talent that's out there.
But Renee, what I would say that the work you're doing is only reason for more optimism, because let me tell you,
Agreed.
2 decades ago, we weren't even asking those questions, right? I mean, the fact that we're asking them and confronting them means, I mean, that to me is progress.
Totally, I completely agree. And I think companies and employers are just opening the aperture of where they're hiring from. And that has been an evolution as well, which again, leads to optimism for sure.
Let me just say, and before I turn it back to Joy, that I too am very optimistic about the future of the humanities and the social sciences in the broad fabric of the nation and in the workforce of the nation. There's so much talk for so long about the enduring crisis of the humanities. And quite frankly, you probably shouldn't be a humanist unless you think there is a crisis in the humanities. But no part of the academy is more continuously evolving, more continuously creative than the humanities and the social sciences. And it is a distinguishing trait of this country that aspects of an education in the liberal arts and sciences is part of an undergraduate education, not just in liberal arts colleges, but also in large state universities, almost uniformly so. And I think the country is better off for it. And I just finally want to close by thanking our 3 wonderful panelists for sharing their own experience in making an interesting set of transitions, after all, you know, from the chill of Middlebury, Vermont to, anyway, I won't go on that. But it's just to thank you all very, very much. And I want to thank all the individuals who participated in asking questions and listened to our webinar this afternoon. Joy, may I ask you to rejoin us and give us a benediction.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, our panelists. Thank you, Bill, for moderating this discussion. And thank you to the audience who asked some really tough questions. We didn't have time to answer all of them today, but you've given us a lot of fruit for future thinking about future events that can address some of the concerns and related issues you brought up. I'll just add one element to the discussion, which I wrote in response to one of the questions, which is that while there's certainly reason to be concerned about the decline in enrollment, particularly in foundational disciplines in the humanities and social sciences, declines especially in the study of foreign languages and languages other than English, sorry, I should say. And we take this seriously, and we think about this every day about how our work at ACLS can help scholars tackle these declines. We are also seeing growth in interesting areas, especially in interdisciplinary areas that connect the kinds of larger issues that all of our panelists in their work, and Bill too, in the various facets of your work are dealing with, that are connecting, the need for expert knowledge and the production of expert knowledge with the solving of problems, with improving the world. I mean, these seem to be the areas that are really attracting students, getting them excited when they look at the university catalog and they're thinking about what to study. They are trying to make that connection. Yes, making a living, also improving the world. And so the more that I think faculty can do to support, not everybody will be able to join in teaching these kinds of courses or developing these kinds of programs, but to support more flexibility, work with administrators to encourage experiment and creativity. Students really seem to be responding to this, and in many cases are leading the way and in helping faculty and empower faculty to teach courses they've always wanted to do, to co-teach, to explore ways they can apply their knowledge or make the case for students who are all about application, who are all about solving real world problems, to say, wait a minute, some of the best solutions to real world problems require or will really benefit from sustained study that may look at the first instance like it has little to do with the real world problem itself, but which in fact will inform it, deep knowledge that will really inform better solutions. So there are a lot of good experiments out there. I will say in closing that one of the roles ACLS has taken upon itself in these years is to connect and amplify people who are coming up with good solutions, who have success stories to tell and to share, ideas and approaches to undergraduate teaching, to mentoring, to networking, to resource building, so that all the humanists and social scientists seeking to make the path easier for themselves, their students, and they're including their PhD students as they seek, again, both to make a living and to make the world a better place. We're trying to connect and amplify those many efforts going on around the country and indeed around the world. So I will just say, this is a long way of saying, stay tuned, come back to us, stay on top of our advertisements and our notices of future events and resources online. So thank you all to our panelists for your time, for your expertise, for the models you embody to our listeners. And thank you again to our listeners. And thank you, Bill, for moderating this discussion. Everybody have a good evening. If you're in the storm band on the East Coast, stay warm and dry. Have a good night.
Thank you, sir.